How's it going, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. This is a really exciting session for me. As most of you all know, I've always come from a more of a photography leaning background in the industry, and having obviously with Panasonic Lumix, leaning heavily in with video these days. So anytime we get an opportunity to talk to a photojournalist, a photographer, anyone that is skilled and highly skilled and sought after in this kind of industry, I'm excited. I love these conversations, and I hope every one of you that's joining in enjoys this kind of conversation too. So we want to get some of the basic stuff out of the way like we do every single week. This is our weekly live streams that we do for connecting in with photographers, videographers, industry members, you name it. We probably have had them on or will have them on in this kind of platform so that we can share and have a conversation with all of you in the Panasonic Lumix community. It is awesome to see everyone dropping in the chat where you're all joining us from. I love seeing this huge spread of places all over the globe. So it's really exciting to see that. For today's session, if you have a question for myself or Daniel on the stream, make sure to tag at Lumix Cameras in the chat. This way it pops up on my screen. I can see it here. We can get to as many of them as we can during this. And hopefully no one feels left out from missing a question. If for some reason we miss it, still drop the question in there. Don't worry about it. We do watch these things after they're posted online, and they are immediately archived on the Panasonic Lumix Cameras channel, or Lumix Cameras channel. So you'll always have an opportunity to jump back on there, watch a previous stream that we've done on multiple different topics. So as you saw in the pre-roll launch for this, we've shifted some of the stuff around. We have the Lumix Pro Services available here in the US and in many other countries as well. If you guys take a look at some of the offers that are available on there to protect your equipment, whether you're looking into the red tier, which is free here in the United States, most other regions also have a free tier. It's great to get you into the platform, get your equipment protected. But if you're someone who actually puts your equipment through the test and really uses it to the best of its abilities, make sure to take a look at the Platinum series that gets you all kinds of extra benefits, a really cool strap from Peak Design, which was provided in the kit, as well as, all the normal stuff you get there, sensor cleanings, all that fun stuff. So, with that, let's actually get this conversation going. So, as we saw here, I am going to be joined by Daniel Berehulak, and if I do this right, hey, how's it going, Daniel?
I'm great. How are you, Sean?
I'm doing good. I think I got all the switching done right this time. So, with every guest that always comes on this stream, I always like to kind of open it up and have everyone kind of hear who you are, and what got you into photography, into this industry.
Sean, thanks so much for having me on this week. My name is Daniel Berehulak. I'm a freelance photojournalist, and I'm based out of Mexico City. I've been living here for the last 4 or 5 years and have been a photographer for the last 20 or so. And I mainly work for the New York Times. Also have an amazing relationship with Lumix and also with other magazines and other clients as well around the world. And I'm from Australia originally. I grew up on a farm outside of Sydney, Australia. And my parents were Ukrainian immigrants that fled during the Second World War and ended up in refugee camps, in migrant camps in Germany, and then came over by boat in 1949 and 50. So I grew up on a farm, and my parents, my upbringing was mixed. I was in Australia, but my parents were Ukrainian, so we spoke Ukrainian at home, Ukrainian dancing, Ukrainian scouts, kind of all of that. And growing up, I helped my dad out on the farm. And he was like an electrical engineer working with air conditioners and refrigerators and stuff. So, we always had around the house National Geographic magazines, and my dad used to love watching kind of documentaries. Um, so I kind of was drawn to photography without kind of knowing that it actually could be a career or anything like that. I think as my parents would have loved to um, have it, they would have loved to have, for me to be a lawyer or a dentist or a doctor or something that was stable and ensured sort of like the economic stability, which they didn't kind of have when they, came over to Australia. So um, I remember having a little kind of like box camera around the house on our farm. And for me, photography was more about sort of capturing moments, having memories. So I was like, in primary school, taking the odd photo on like school excursions of my friends and, the cat or the dogs on our farm and stuff like that. And sort of after high school, with my brother and my sister, we were always talking about, like what could I be doing? And my sister was always kind of pushing me and going like, look, do something creative. And she was always kind of there as kind of like a stable, a rock of support. And during that time, I did a history degree, still not knowing what I wanted to do. I went into retail. My brother was a manager and he got me a job. So it was stable. I was earning some money, but in my early 20s, it just wasn't enough. I saw it as a job, but it just didn't satisfy me kind of like creatively as well. And during this time, I was playing sport. I was playing volleyball. So I got to play during college. I had the privilege to travel and play in Indonesia, in Germany. And it was on one of these trips during my college days that I stumbled upon a World Press photo exhibit in Vienna, in Austria. And, I'd seen photographs in magazines and in news. My dad sort of like really sort of followed the news internationally. You could ask him about any country and he would, rattle off, who's the president, prime minister, what was going on at the time. So it kind of like, this from an early age, I had this, I don't know, kind of connection with things that are, going around the world, and especially back in Ukraine as well, where we had family members still there. But during this World Press photo exhibit, in Australia, we can, I was, it was grew up on a farm. It was an awesome, upbringing that we, that we had. And during the exhibit, I saw all these photographs from around the world, and social issues and things that I didn't know about. And it just really, really kind of opened my eyes to more things that were going on around the world that I didn't know about. And it just kind of like stuck with me that images could have such a resounding impact. And I remember that year there was also an Australian photographer, Craig Golding, who had won, and I was like, wow, like an Australian can be recognized, for a World Press photo. So it kind of connected all the way like back to home, that this isn't such a foreign thing. So when I went back, I started doing photography courses. I'd actually studied, a small subject in high school, but it's just, it never ever was a possible career or anything like that. I didn't know anyone who was a photographer,
Yeah.
My parents were very much working class, and so were my friends and their families. So yeah, after university, I kind of, was working in retail, but I then started like reading books, buying magazines. I, bought a camera and started, this is back in the film day, and started shooting a ton of film. And all I remember was like my photographs were awful. They were like terrible. I was missing the moment. I was chopping off heads and all of that. But I was just building, my kind of like database. And what ended up happening was that I turned the camera to sport, which I played through volleyball. and it became a natural kind of thing. And my sister, unfortunately and abruptly, passed away in 1999, kind of a disease, and it kind of changed my world. It was like, look, life is short. We only get one chance on it. And she'd always been so supportive and patient and listening. So, within a week, 2 weeks, I quit the job that I had, and I signed up for a photography course, and I promised myself, and I was like, I took a leap of faith, and it was like, I don't know how I'm going to get into photography, but all I know is I'm going to do it, and like absolute blind ambition and delusion. So, I kind of like started, connecting the dots, and I started, taking photographs of sport, first volleyball, and then going out to, fields and soccer. And in Australia, it's great because we have so many sports. So I started kind of like building my folio, so to speak, of shooting kind of like amateur sports. And then I enrolled in college, which I ended up dropping out of at the end of first year. And I got a job sort of freelancing for a very small agency. And what that gave me was a platform to sit next to world-class photographers. And at that time, the Sydney Morning Herald had some of the best sports photographers in the world. And, I would buy the Sydney Morning Herald, one of the newspapers, and, open up the sports section. And these photographs were not only sport, but they were like photojournalism as well, not just the action. It was like the lead up to the game, the fans, like the whole kind of story. And I just remember just, looking at all these photographs and just thinking to myself, how the hell do they get these photos? Silhouette, how do you do a silhouette? And yeah, anyway, so I started working for a very small agency, and it was photographing like high school athletics. And my boss then would sell the images back to the parents. So that kind of like, I started building up my experience, and it gave me an opportunity to shoot, weekend sport and like the rugby league and the rugby union. And I kind of slowly worked my way up with that. And the awesome thing with that was I ended up, working for a small agency. You get to sit next to these amazing photographers. So what I did at the start was like, I bugged the hell out of them. I would take my shitty folio and show them and present them. And, it was that time Craig Golding, Tim Clayton, and Steve Christo, 3 photographers who were incredibly generous with their time, and each one had a different kind of approach in terms of giving feedback. And I remember Tim was like very straightforward. It was like, that's crap, that doesn't work, or anything. I remember Craig being really sweet and saying like, gee, Daniel, like, I really like that photo, but I just don't think it's your best work, and I just really appreciated the time. And, during that, I made a ton of mistakes and kind of kept on growing. And I got an opportunity to shoot the Olympics. I was meant to be processing film, and the agency we were affiliated with from France, one of the photographers was sick and couldn't make it over. So I ended up kind of working, I like begged my boss. I was like, please keep me on. I know for a fact that he later absolutely regretted that, because, shooting 20, 30 rolls of film a day, I think they were scanning in maybe 4 frames per roll or 2 frames per roll, something like that. And man, I was missing the action. I was chopping off heads. I was photographing the water polo, and then they also gave me volleyball because I played volleyball and stuff. But I just remember, being there at the end of the day, and everyone's like, there's a computer there, and they've scanned all the images in, and they're looking at the frames, and there's like multiple exposures of gymnastics and these amazing shapes and, underwater cameras and all of that. And I just remember being absolutely blown away by the photography and just the energy of sport and capturing the moment and motion and all of that. And I just, yeah, I kind of like fell in love. And I remember being quite drunken at the bar, sort of like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., sidling up to one of the French photographers. And, I went over and I was like, hey, Olivier, like, man, like, what's the secret? And this guy was amazing. It was like, what's the secret, of like being a good photographer? And, he puts down his cigarette and like leans over and goes, Daniel, you have to work. You have to work hard. And I just sat there going, okay, like, is there anything else? Like,
Yeah.
shoot with this camera or with that camera, use Fuji Velvia, like follow the light. I
Yeah.
was like looking for all these things, and I just felt kind of cheated and robbed. And it was only years later that like it started to click, and this was sort of like after proving myself at this one small agency, getting to be a Getty Images stringer in Australia shooting sport, which was amazing, and then working a ton, and then saving up enough money to travel around the world. And I also organized with Getty to shoot the 2004 Olympics for them as a stringer. And I was like, hey, I'm in Europe. So I'd love to also be part of the team, and somehow it worked out, which was great. But I remember stopping off in Thailand kind of before that, and the famous photographer James Nashtway was. I ended up going down to the south, and there were skirmishes on the border, and we were there in the aftermath of a bomb blast. And I just remember kind of like just being, I don't know, like being more drawn to news photography.
Yeah.
And sport was like great, but I'd like done 4 years, and I felt that at a point it kind of like, you have celebration, you have the ejection, you have the final, you have the quarterfinals, semifinals, finals, and it's kind of like it's the same kind of thing. Yes, it's different, but at this point, after being in the industry for like 4 years or so, and slowly kind of like improving, I remember feeling kind of like, hey, I really want to see the world. I really want to learn about how people live around the world. I want to know about the issues that they face day to day, and the things that you don't, you do see in the news, and also the stories that you don't get to see in the news as well.
Yeah.
And I, during all that time, I'd been reading books and following photographers, and ended up in southern Thailand at the same hotel that James Nachtwey is staying at. One of the most incredible photojournalists of the past few generations, and inspired myself and many others as well. And I remember getting up early, going to breakfast around 7, like hoping to see him there to kind of introduce myself and kind of, try to learn from this incredible guy. And I remember going there, and after like 1 or 2 days, I'm not seeing him. 3 days, I'm not seeing him. And then, I got to befriend one of the guys who worked at the door at the hotel, and I was like, hey, Mr. Nachtwey, have you seen him? And it was like, oh, sir, he like left at 4:30 a.m. He's been leaving at 4:30 a.m. like every day. And I at that point in time, you're like, what is he doing? Like, where is he going at 4:30 a.m.? And it was, to get ahead of the light, and that's kind of where it sort of started clicking. What, like, hey, you have to work hard, and it's like putting in the hours,
Oh, yeah.
learning about what you're photographing, context and all of that. So yeah, so after the Olympics, Getty offered me a staff position in London covering news. I'd expressed to my bosses in Australia that I really kind of wanted to, sort of put sport to the side and focus on news and grow a career. And my first assignment in London in 2005, I remember turning up like 3 hours late Like I got completely lost. These are the days before sat nav
Yeah.
and Google Maps and all of that. So it was my first day as well, and I just like felt so embarrassed. And I remember like talking to my bosses in New York and in London, and I remember like just questioning and going like, hey, how do you develop your news sense? How do you develop all those skills that you kind of like take for granted, know what a story is? I was trying to read news, but it wasn't clicking. And I
Yeah.
remember Pancho Bernasconi, one of the top guy now in Getty, was like, hey, like the fact that you're asking yourself this is like you're on track. you
Yeah.
know you just it's to kind of keep on kind of going with that. So I covered a lot of news. I kept on making mistakes and learning. And I got the opportunity to do some assignments in Ukraine. I pitched a story to go back there for the 20th anniversary of Chernobyl, the nuclear the explosion. Went to Niger, Pakistan, and it was kind of after 3 or 4 years that we then sort of started talking about another move, and they offered me a position in Delhi, being sort of looking over the region, which included Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I remembered kind of like at that point, like, cool, I'm starting to do, be based out somewhere, learning about different cultures and doing more of that. Like I'd, been slowly learning. But even that kind of like, yeah, I mean, at every stage you think you're like, cool, I'd love to have like a staff job. Then you get to the staff job and you're like, cool, like, all right, I really need to, hone my craft and get it to the next level. So, I was immediately, yeah, drawn to kind of like Pakistan, especially in Afghanistan, and started doing more trips out there. And there was one assignment which was covering the Pakistan floods that I think changed the way that I would look at photography and the way I would approach photography. It was kind of like another one of those turning points in my career, and I worked closely with other colleagues from Reuters and other agencies to cover this kind of news story over a 4 to 6 week period, working long hours, following the story, trying to be as diligent as I possibly could, going to the top of the country, to the bottom of the country, walking through floodwaters, convincing pilots from the Pakistan army that were doing rescue missions, to get access onto helicopters, and because they wanted to show the magnitude of the floods. And the photographs were widely published in the New York Times, and also that year I won a World Press Photo for first prize for the Pakistan floods. And I remember being there at the ceremony, and Kira Pollock, who was the director of photography at Time Magazine, and another legendary photographer, David Burnett. I remember having a dialogue conversation with them, and one of the photos was nearby, and there was a photograph of a man and a boy walking through floodwaters, and there was like a truck light behind, sort of shining through. And this photograph was widely published. It was, Time Magazine's top 10 frames of the year. And I remember they're asking me, like, okay, cool. So what's the story behind, the people like in the photograph?
Yeah.
And I didn't know, that day we had sort of ventured out away from, the vehicle and car, and probably walked like 4 or 5 kilometers during, with floodwaters. I didn't have a translator with me. My Urdu wasn't that great in terms of being able to ask them questions or interview them. And I just felt ashamed, like that I captured these moments that had been published around the world, and photographically were had the impact, but like I couldn't tell you where they were going, what they were
Yeah.
doing. So based off of this kind of conversation, and this guilt that I had, I pitched to my editor at the time, Hugh Pinney in London, like, hey, I'd love to go back to find them
Yeah.
and to do a before and after. So I printed up like and kind of like do a year after kind of follow up, and working for agencies, anniversaries are kind of like you can kind of like pitch a story of like an anniversary. Hey, what's happening a year later? So, driven by guilt and trying to make amends, I kind of pitched this sort of like before and after, 1 year later, and I did landscapes, and I wanted to find these people.
Yeah.
During the assignment, I'd been taking Google Maps pins of like if I was in a helicopter, we drop into a village, I drop a Google pin, and then like Basira village, and you do a little thing. So I ended up knowing where I took the photograph, and this is kind of like before your GPS on your,
Yeah.
your files and and all of that. And so I was able to go back to the village and I went with the local journalist Asim Tanvir, and I had all of the prints 6x4s, and I had a print of them and frames before and after, and we literally started driving along the road and stopping off at tea stalls in markets, showing these photographs. Hey, do you know these people? Whatever. After 3 days, we found them.
Wow.
We got to this like chicken shop, and they were like, "No, don't know." And then the mechanic shop next door, we just asked, "Hey, have you seen us?" Like, "Oh yeah, that's my neighbor." So he called them up. They were nervous. And they ended up meeting, and I conducted the interview that probably should have done a year ago,
Yeah.
and I did a kind of before and after photograph. I got them to the same spot. Obviously they weren't like waist deep in water,
Yeah.
but to kind of juxtapose, um, and then I realized like the biggest thing, it was the interview more so than the actual photo that mattered, the journalism
Yeah.
behind it. And it was at that point that I realized, okay, cool. Like I've, I'm a proficient photographer. Um, the next sort of step to become a better photographer was to become, the way I saw it, was to become a better journalist. So that kind of like
Yeah.
what drove me. And then a few years later, 2013, I took like another kind of leap of faith and went freelance, in order to kind of work on sort of longer term projects. And, because I was still getting kind of pulled in to do sport, and I kind of really wanted to do like in-depth documentary work, and be able to really
Yeah.
spend time with people to learn their backstories in order to tell their stories better,
Yeah.
and that's when I started working with the New York Times in like 2013, and working with amazing journalists, and working in Afghanistan and Liberia and Antarctica. um, I mean, to date, yeah, I mean, I think around over 60 countries or something like that, that I've had the privilege to kind of to work in. Um, so yeah, it's every year, I'm trying to push myself to better understand the stories that I'm working on, in order to better be able to tell those stories and to photograph and do that with context.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. That's such an amazing, kind of journey that you've had, going from having a camera on a farm to where you are today, and the projects that, we're going to talk about in a minute here. Like it's just amazing, that that drive that I think everybody has that kind of drive, but it's actually acting on it. It's actually being curious to go and, just like you said, take that leap of faith and do something with it, not just have it lay dormant and, kind of nagging at the back of your head like, hey, you should have done this. Um I want to I want to bring up the articles actually and talk about this project, the Mexico border wall project, because some of these images, I mean, they're stunning images, and obviously for those of us in the United States, this is a big topic that's happening right now. I mean, it's a huge topic for anybody that's you know having to deal with the situations of trying to get from oppression, from issues, from dangers that they're in to another place. So, could you give us a little kind of background as to what this project is and
Yeah,
what the goal
absolutely.
is?
So, about 6 weeks ago, I was assigned by the New York Times to head to the border, and with the change of administration, and we did a number of interviews with people. But with the change of administration, just the fact that Trump had been so oppressive on migration kind of like policies and started building the wall, that even the change to a Biden administration was a sign that people in Honduras who were experiencing extremely difficult conditions after a climate change, after the hurricanes, violence, also, in Guatemala and Honduras, political instability in Nicaragua. So many people saw this as an opportunity to kind of like to make a move to the border. So we had been noticing much larger numbers, and a kind of like a new wave of immigration kind of like spurring up. So I went up with the New York Times bureau chief, Maria Abi Habib, and Al, a translator and also a journalist, up to kind of investigate to see what the situation was on the border. And in a 10-day period there, we published 3 stories, and there's one still that is coming out. The first story was kind of like a general evaluation of the situation, and and seeing what the differences are. So we flew up to Ciudad Juarez up in the north on the other side of El Paso, Texas, and spent a number of days kind of like interviewing kind of like key people there, officials from the Mexican government, people that worked in the migrant shelters as well. And what we kind of experienced was that there was a massive influx. The Biden administration had agreed to take in migrants that were under NPP who had applied for asylum, but then were waiting in Mexico before they were granted asylum to then be able to follow through, cross the border. So already the migrant shelters were full. What was also happening at the same time, you have all of these networks and you have these coyotes, these people smugglers who solicit $6,000, $9,000 per person, from Honduras, from Guatemala, to literally transport them all the way across to the border and then facilitate their crossing. And these networks are, these are the cartels. So their networks are polished. They're, if there's a change in law, they're ahead of the curve. They know what's happening. If Border Patrol is clamping down in one area, they're then moving to another area. They're always reacting and always a step ahead, a Mexican official once told us. So you have so many people who, maybe the family have paid this money, or they've actually had to sell their house. And many people have done that, like in Guatemala, taken out a loan in order to pay these coyotes. They then, like with a small bag of their belongings, make this kind of perilous journey. And on this journey, then you have also people kidnapping them, extorting more money from their families, and violence on these kind of routes kind of moving forward. because the coyotes, the human traffickers, had these clear routes. There were hundreds, if not thousands, that were at different points in on the U.S. border every day, are kind of like being kind of moved over. They're hoping to apply for asylum, many of them at least. And what we noticed, in the second story, it's quite exemplary, what is happening. So the US government had agreed to take in the MPP, the people who'd been waiting on the Mexican side, but the people who had actually recently crossed, they were kind of telling them, hey, we're going to help you. But then what they were doing was, just in this photograph here with Vilma, from Honduras with the two kids, they then also they're flying them, they're crossing over in the Rio Grande Valley, and then the US government were flying them over to El Paso, and then literally deporting them and putting them over. At no point were they kind of told, like, hey, this is what's happening. So this day, on the bridge here, this is the international bridge that connects one of the bridges that connects El Paso with Ciudad Juarez. And one of the Mexican officials who we'd interviewed, who had, one of his roles is to facilitate and process all of these people when they come back to the Mexican side, to then put them into the shelter system and find them like safe refuge. Because as soon as they come off the bridge, they're also targets for people smugglers. They can also be kidnapped there as well. So it actually is quite dangerous coming across. So we just sort of sat down for lunch, and then we'd done a number of interviews, and he called us and said, hey, there's 5 busloads of people that have flown over that they're deporting. So, I jumped into the rental car that I had, drove, parked the car, ran onto the bridge, and you can see the buses. And then within 5 minutes, the Border Patrol started bringing them over the bridge. Once they crossed back over, they were there. So this is one of the Border Patrol leading out the first group. And I think there were 149 people that were that day that were deported. And this is something new that the US government had started to do, was not giving the heads up to the Mexican government that, hey, we have these amount of people coming over, prepare the shelters or anything like that. They were literally dumping them at different hours of the day. And what was happening was the people would get to the other bridge, and they would ask, so where are we? Are we in the US? And, one of the families asked me, and I was like, ma'am, you're in Mexico. What city? Ciudad Juarez. And so many people that had done this whole journey, that had paid coyotes, and so many people just broke down in utter anguish and desperation, that they were back in Mexico after having crossed in a completely different part of Mexico, in the Rio Grande Valley, near Brownsville and McAllen. So we noticed this was a new tactic, and another journalist sort of suggested that this possibly could be a way of disparaging a lot of people to reconnect with their smugglers, in order to try again. Because if they tried in the Rio Grande Valley near Reynosa or McAllen, and then they deported them, they would then possibly keep on trying. So by flying them to another city, it possibly was a tactic to disorient them, and to hinder their efforts to sort of come over. So that day, 149 people sort of were deported, streamed over, and the process of getting them into migrant shelters. What we also noticed with families was that there are a number of people who are calling by WhatsApp to their coyote to try to reconnect in order to
Yeah.
try to go again. So then they were asking, hey, how do we get back to Monterrey, another city, which is kind of like a hub that they kind of like shoot out towards the border. So this was a piece that sort of like published as kind of like a small little sort of journal, like as one part. So we were working on, two different stories, and then this was kind of like a spot news event that would kind of like happen that we were there at, and it was quite a harrowing affair for families, and it was able to kind of show like the reality of what was happening on the border at the moment. So that kind of like that published. And a lot of times on these trips, there are so many kind of like considerations in terms of like security as well, because the cartel are in control of so many areas there. So we're in touch with the New York Times. There's we will have a WhatsApp group, and if we're going anywhere, it's like, hey, we're going here. It's like we're going to be here for an hour, continually kind of like checking in, and then also doing a location tracking as well. And then the security guy who's based overseas will be monitoring at different times of the day. The other editor, Craig, who was working with in New York, is also kind of monitoring. So a lot of times you're also taking into consideration safety and all. And this photograph was a rare sighting and something that I've never seen before. So the families came off the bridge. They then went to a Mexican kind of offices, government offices, and they were starting to get processed. And during this time, we're sort of interviewing people and finding their backstories and what they're fleeing from, the reasons why they're taking such a perilous journey. Some people have, family that they're trying to reconnect with in the US, and just looking for stability, away from, somewhere where they can have a family and not have to worry about, there's so many things that kind of like do them. But in this instance, there were people who go into migrant shelters, and this was a family who had obviously called their coyote their people smuggler. So I was photographing another family, and I just heard this like round, and this car from nowhere. There's an alleyway behind these offices, came from nowhere, and like a F1 pit stop. Within 5 seconds, a family was like shoved into the back of this car, and as quickly as it arrived, it disappeared. I remember just staring at another photographer and one of the Mexican officials, and it was like, is that what I think it was? Was that like just a pickup of a coyote or a smuggler? And they're like, yep, that's like, they come in vans, they come in different vehicles. But it was like, just the brazenness of doing it right in front of like the Mexican sort of like officials was insane. And that kid there is one of the people working for this whole kind of massive network of human smugglers that was there. Another big sort of issue at the moment, which now I'm leading to the third story, there's been a massive number of unaccompanied minors that are crossing the border. There's been a lot of discussion over the last weeks, and CBP have released statistics that some of the highest numbers that they've ever seen in increases of unaccompanied minors. So children that are either themselves kind of like going over or with the help of coyotes, trying to kind of like make their way. So we looked at a lot of times when you're working on a story, you're trying to work out, okay, how do I visualize this? It's really, really difficult to do it from doing it with the people smugglers, because it is so dangerous, and they don't want you messing around with their business, or identifying where they cross and all of that, because it's massive economic difference for them if anything changes. So one of the ways that we could sort of understand more was there was a migrant shelter for unaccompanied minors on the Ciudad Juarez side. And throughout this sort of 10-day period where, in the start of the first 3 days, you're doing interviews with, a lot of the key sort of people there. And, you have to explain to, and sort of convince why it's important to kind of like tell the stories of these unaccompanied minors who are in a shelter, with the Mexican government. This is one of many shelters. And, that day when we were there were more people who had just been deported. The group of kids there had just been deported that day, and they were just being taken into the facility. One of the challenges of photographing in a facility unaccompanied minors is identity, because you don't know how it can affect their families, affect them. So privacy is a major issue. So as a photographer, it's definitely sort of challenging. I'm looking at ways to make a silhouette. I'm looking at ways of showing the context of what they're experiencing in a place like this. Here you have a boy calling his family back home in Honduras, and you're looking at ways, when they turn around and you can see their face. I'm not shooting, and I'm waiting for them to kind of like, and just certain kind of ways of maybe obscuring their face by choosing a different angle, maybe moving slightly to the left and down or whatever it may be. Yeah. So this was kind of like the main sort of challenge of working in some way like this. And then also on the editing side as well, filing the images in, I'm also communicating with my editor, and my editor is also conscious of this, but it's kind of like, hey, can you please have a look at these images? Can you please make sure that nothing goes out that you deem to be identifiable? The great thing also is that when Craig Allen was working on this project, he also leaned on the legal services of the New York Times as well, for them to kind of review the photographs, and also kind of just to get an extra like layer of like, of screening. So, I'm sort of screening by the way I'm shooting. I'm then filing in 60, 80 photographs that I'd taken in this shelter. Craig is then doing a selection of that, and then we're also sending it to legal, just to ensure that, we're not putting in danger or harm or risk any of these kids or their families when you're photographing in these sort of circumstances. So that's kind of like one of the challenges, and this was kind of like a very lucky sort of basketball sort of scene where it was like, backlit, so you can underexpose and get more of a silhouette. And this is kind of like camera wise, I like to use a 24-70 lens, just because, you really kind of feel the proximity. You have to be there with the zoom lens. There's some images that I'll show later on of kind of like some of the border crossings of using a 70-200, but this is one of the art classes, and I was kind of like shifting, trying to, also with depth of field, blurring out people in the background as well, and focusing on details and things like that. But you kind of get an idea of their experience in these shelters.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one of the things that people might not necessarily have thought about in photojournalism. You're used to seeing so many stories of adults where, in some states, those that aren't, or in some places, if you're not so educated on kind of the rules that you're supposed to be following, there's no way to put it. It's just not something that people think about, is the security of the people that you're photographing. And it's it's amazing to hear. You know, obviously this is a very specific challenge. I mean, you know, it's not every day that you're hearing situations like this at the border, especially here, you know, in the United States. I mean, it's getting more and more attention, and the work you're doing, I think, is critical in that. And having, you know, the connection that you've been describing, you know, the understanding of how everything is happening, you know, what the risks are involved, and being incredibly respectful of every aspect of it. I'm blown away. I mean, this
Yeah.
is, I think, one of the quietest I've ever been on our streams, because I'm genuinely speechless. You know, someone who lives personally here. I mean, I live in Texas. I live up in, you know, the Austin area, and you know, these aren't things that ever necessarily impact you day to day, because you know, it's that thought process of, oh, it's somewhere else, it's not right here. And you
Totally.
know, a lot of people are privileged to have that feeling, but seeing this work and exposing it to as many people as possible, I think is an incredibly important thing. And it's amazing that you're able to do this and
Yeah.
have that connection behind it.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, look, it is very, very important work, and I think it's very important for us to actually know why people are making this sort of like this dangerous kind of voyage. It isn't to steal jobs. It's just to be able to kind of like provide for their families and provide, you know, a level of security, of stability. And you know, I've glazed over a number of sort of backstories of like families that, you know, if you go to these articles, but you know, an integral kind of part of the photography process is, you know, is the interviewing, is the spending time and really understanding why they've left, where they're hoping to go, why the challenges that they've faced along the way as well. You know, hearing, you know, devastating stories of kidnap, of violence, you know, along the way. And you know, what we hope to do as journalists, as photojournalists, is really, really kind of like share these stories, you know, because, you know, I think that regardless of where you are in the world, you know, there's a basic kind of premise of, hey, I want to be able to provide for my family, and I want to be able to
Exactly.
do that, and provide security. And I know this is an issue which has been, you know, grossly politicized as well. And we hope by telling these people's stories and showing, you know, the impact or what is actually happening on a daily basis up there on the border, hopefully it shifts, you know, little thinking, or, you know, opens our minds and our understanding to what is happening. And look, the response from these articles, and also I did a post in the first story. There's a photograph of Gladys, who is from Honduras, and she was traveling with her 23-year-old son who's cerebral palsy. Her other two kids have, yeah, that's the photograph there. So we met Gladys kind of, I think, on the second day of reporting, and it was one of the, you know, when you go to these sort of shelters, this was a place called Hotel Filter Hotel, and people come here with and undergo like a 2-week quarantine for COVID, technically, before they go into the migrant shelters. And because of the massive influx, they're having to kind of slightly fast track that. And but you know, we sat down with Gladys, and she, you know, told us this story of like, you know, paying coyotes. I think it was like $9,000 for her and her son. She can't, like, Henry doesn't walk, so she has to carry him.
Wow.
So I think they allowed, you know, and the coyote kind of said like, oh, don't worry, you know, you'll get help along the way, and you know, they'll transport you and your son. And there was none of that. You know, she had to kind of like fend for herself. Luckily, she made it up to Juarez, and then got up there. And what happened was, yeah, they told her, I'm sorry, there's no access, where, the list is, the list is long, etc. And I spent like a morning with her photographing her looking after Henry, and man, just to see like her, take off his clothes, carry him to the bathroom, shower him, wash him, bathe him, carry him back, dry him, give him all of his medication, which is ridiculously expensive, whether it's in Honduras or whether it's here in Mexico. And because he's incapacitated, she wasn't able to also, like, she doesn't want to leave him and then go and work, because she's worried about his safety, what happens to him if I go and work. And she's like, look, I'm happy to stay wherever. And it's just kind of like sharing these stories of like the selflessness of a mother, like, dedicating, her life just to, try to make an attempt to go over to family that were in New Hampshire. And I did a post on Instagram about Gladys specifically, and that outreach of people. So many people don't know how to help. So many people reached out and was like, hey, how can I help? And these are the challenges of being a journalist and an activist. Like me personally, I would love to be able to set up like a GoFundMe page, but in terms of the ethics of journalism, you have to decide on what, side of the fence you're on,
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't necessarily see the direct connection that your photographs have to the people in your photographs. But with stories like Gladys and also Vilma up on the bridge, sitting there with her two children, 5 years old and 2 years old, so many people reached out. So, as journalists, and we contacted New York Times, hey, what can we do? What's the best way to do this? So we're able to provide a list of NGOs that were working on the border, and I was able to kind of like reply in my post and say, hey, these are the guys who are actually working on the border. And here is the list here. But it gives people an avenue. A week or two later, myself and Maria received, the bureau chief received an email from an attorney saying, hey, we saw your story in the New York Times, and we saw the story of Gladys. And I just wanted to let you know, this is a photograph of her crossing the bridge. And the attorney had decided to take upon her asylum case, and she was reunited with family in New Hampshire, And it's like, you never know the impact that photos can have, but, there's historical value, and then you never know how people are going to be moved or react or want to help or not. And a lot of times there are so many like good-willed people out there who, might not necessarily know what's happening on the border, but when they see images like this, when they see stories like this, that's when, it's incredible,
Exactly.
The connection that photographs can have and build empathy and connect people. And I had people reaching out with Vilma, hey, how can we pay for the $12,000 for that specific person or whatever? And there was like massive kind of outreach. So, I mean, look, this isn't always the case. And a lot of times you never know, but, for something like this, and it's a story that I think a lot of people are following in the news. So it was amazing to see that kind of like outreach and that outpouring of generosity and people just willing to like, hey, how can I help? How can I help these people? Because, the US, Australia, my parents are migrants, they fled war, and ended up there. So we're very, very sort of grateful. And they started, working. My father had to, he had a pharmacology degree. And when he went to Australia, obviously it wasn't valid. So he worked for the water board and worked in sewers for 2 years to pay off the ticket for the boat ride to Australia. Like these are people who want to work hard, and provide for their families. And I think there's so many kind of, immigrants now, and the US is so multicultural that there are so many people who do want to help.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's amazing when you actually get that kind of like feedback as well. And you see, it kind of just restores your faith in humanity. It restores your faith in journalism, and it's kind of like, cool. All right, now back to work. Got to keep on going, keep on telling stories, and keep at it.
exactly. I mean, it's why I always get so excited when we have an opportunity to talk with a photojournalist, with anybody that is on the ground, actually, in the field, covering stories and bringing back that fact that, I mean, for decades, photojournalism, is key in spreading the information, spreading the realities of different parts of the world, bringing everyone's kind of collective knowledge into a better place. And just like you said, it's challenging because things get so politicized no matter where you look. It's not a one region thing. Every location deals with that. But understanding that the power that photography and videography in supporting these messages, in you said it perfect, bringing that feeling of pride in humanity back, that there are people that, if they're just exposed to what's going on, they become this, like, okay, now, yes, I want to do something about this, I want to find a way to help. And it's been such a rare thing over the last number of years. You haven't really seen that much positivity in a dark topic.
Yeah.
That as dark of a topic as this is, with the pain and the sadness that's shown in these images, there's hope in it because it's bringing light to the challenge. And I'm just in awe of the work that you're doing. And I wish we had much more time to talk about this on the stream.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to find a way to get you to come back and kind of cover another topic. But yeah, for anybody watching, I encourage you to take a look at these articles. Follow Daniel. Take a look at the work that he's doing. It is amazing work, as you guys have all seen. Yeah, this is the most speechless I've been in any of our streams. So so yeah, I know that we had more stuff to talk about. We wanted to show some of the other lenses, but unfortunately we're at the time that I have for the stream today. Where can everybody follow you and keep up to date on all the work that you're doing, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of, I've been greenlit a border project with the New York Times, so I'm going to be heading back up, and I'm also looking at possibly doing part of the actual route itself, and then also going to Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, and kind of like looking at the situation there, just to kind of like bring in the bigger picture. There'll be work coming out in the New York Times. My Instagram is at Daniel Berehulak, and my Twitter is Berehulak as well. And I also have a Facebook page as well, which I need to update more often. But I certainly do have that. So yeah.
And we'll link to everything in the video description. I'll drop stuff into the chat as well for links to all your pages, because just like we're saying, this is incredible work. It originally had like intended in finding a way that we can talk about the equipment and stuff, but the stories, hearing hearing this work, hearing what you're doing, it trumps I hate that phrase. It it
Good reason.
overpowers the
Yeah.
the concept of gear and equipment. We're all gearheads, but you know,
One thing I would like to add to that is that, the great thing with mirrorless cameras now, and, one of the advantages of many of the systems, and especially Lumix, is, now I've gone through a whole development of starting with film, and going through cameras, the advanced kind of sport cameras that have fast autofocusing and frame rates and all of that. But having a camera that, I remember Tim Henman, one of the tennis players, I was shooting behind at the Australian Open one time, and he kind of like turned around, and yelled out, sounds like a gun going off. And now what I love about the cameras is, you can work with respect, you can work, silently. So it's just, my presence that is there. I don't have to worry about the sound of the equipment, and that I think has changed, and made photography, I think, a lot more personal, and allows you to kind of like, people aren't distracted by the sound of a shutter. I'm not interrupting. I'm being more respectful of what's going on, and I think that's one of them, awesome advantages of Lumix system of mirrorless, period, which has helped me tremendously, in my photography, in terms of like capturing moments that are there.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's amazing, the being able to just have the equipment just do its job, stay out of the way so that you can focus on the important parts of why we're
Absolutely.
capturing photos. And I know a lot of the people that follow us and a lot of the people that interact with us on Lumix Live are videographers, and every single thing that was discussed today is so relevant with video as well. It's that, have the story, learn about, the topic that you're doing. I am just I I
And
don't know
that's
how many
why
ways I could say.
that's why we do it, right? The equipment is a tool. It's very, very important tool. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's kind of like it's a tool that allows you to kind of like really hone those stories and craft those stories and tell them in a more powerful way.
Yeah.
And having that equipment there to back you is priceless.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for
All right,
spending the
thank you.
time with us.
Thanks
Um,
for having me on.
this was legitimately one of the, for me, and I hope everyone that watched, I think this was one of the most amazing, conversations we've had. I am in awe at the work that you're doing, and I hope everyone that um, views this and listens to the conversation and sees the striking images that you've created, follows it and educates and shares it to people that, may not be looking at this. I think these are amazing things that all of us can be doing to better our society and better our world. So, um, thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thanks. It's been a real pleasure.
So, um, so I want to thank everybody in the on YouTube, and I believe we're also broadcasting into the Photo Plus platform today. Thank you all so much for joining. We will be live again next week. I encourage you all again to take a look at Daniel's work. Take a look at the articles. They are on the New York Times, and yeah, I look forward to seeing you all next week. Nothing witty this week. So, thank you all, and have a good rest of your week.